It is the summer of 213 BC. Roman ships approach the Greek city-state of Syracuse that has allied itself with Rome's great enemy, Carthage. Suddenly, one of the Roman ships catches fire, bursting into flames, throwing the invaders into confusion. Surely, they are too far away from the enemy battlements to be attacked. Then, a flash of light catches their eyes. The defenders are using giant mirrors to reflect the sun's rays, burning the Roman vessels like ants in a magnifying glass. From his vantage point ashore, an old man watches on as his secret weapons wreak havoc on the invaders. His name? Archimedes, the greatest inventor of the ancient world. The man known to history as Archimedes was born in the city of Syracuse in Sicily during the early 3rd century BC, probably around 287 BC. At that time, Syracuse was the foremost city of the island and the greatest of the Greek cities of southern Italy, a region known as Magna Graecia, Great Greece. Such was the level of Greek colonization of it since the 8th century BC. Thus, although born in Sicily, Archimedes was Greek and emerged from within a Greek cultural and intellectual milieu. While Archimedes is commonly recognized as one of the greatest scientists and inventors in history, very little is known definitively about his life. Brief accounts of his life and career are found in the writings of Greek and Roman authors from centuries after his lifetime, and these have been embellished over the centuries. For instance, while we know that Archimedes must have been born early in the 3rd century BC, the notion that he was born in the year 287 BC is based on a claim by the 12th century AD Byzantine historian John Tzetzes. He wrote that Archimedes was approximately 75 years old when he died in 212 BC. Still, while Tzetzes was writing a millennium and a half after Archimedes' times, he does cite Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian from Sicily writing in the 1st century BC, as evidence for these details of the scientist's life. Furthermore, according to the Greek mathematician Eutocius of Ascalon, who lived at the turn of the 6th century AD, a biography of Archimedes was written by a friend named Heraclides. While this has been lost in the centuries since, and parts of Diodorus's histories have only survived in fragmentary form, we can assume that writers like Tzetzes and Eutocius, who were writing many centuries after Archimedes' time, did have substantial source material from which they drew their information. Finally, and perhaps most importantly of all, there are several scientific treatises that Archimedes wrote himself that have survived down to the present day, in which he provided prefatory letters to fellow mathematicians which included further details about his own life. In one of his treatises, the Sand Reckoner, Archimedes states that his father was an astronomer named Phidias, who calculated the difference in size between the sun and the moon. Based on the fact that Phidias was also the name of the most famous sculptor in ancient Greece, who decorated the Parthenon and made the monumental statue of Athena Parthenos that stood inside the iconic temple on the Athenian Acropolis, Archimedes' modern-day translator, Reviel Netz, a specialist in ancient mathematics, suggests that the scientist's paternal grandfather was an artist who named his son in homage to the great sculptor. Netz goes further by suggesting that Archimedes' name, which may be interpreted as the mind of the principle, is a reference to the principle or order of the universe. The Greek philosopher Plato, who lived in the 4th century BC, believed that the universe was governed by rational mathematical principles. Perhaps Phidias was a follower of Plato and gave his son this name to reflect his belief in a rational and harmonious cosmic order. Apart from this, nothing is known about Archimedes' family and early life. His mother's name is unknown. There is no indication if he had any siblings, or whether he himself was married and had any children. Instead, many of the ancient works which mention Archimedes pick up his story much later in his life, during the Second Punic War. This includes the life of Marcellus, written by the 2nd century AD Greco-Roman historical biographer Plutarch, and the 2nd century BC Greek historian Polybius, whose histories have provided a universal history of the world and the rise of the Roman Republic down to his own day. Much of Archimedes' story relates to the history of his hometown, Syracuse, in the 3rd century BC. The city was founded in the 730s BC by Greek colonists from the city of Corinth, one of the greatest cities of mainland Greece and one which was strategically located within both the Gulf of Corinth and the Isthmus of Corinth, the latter being the narrow neck of land that connects the Peloponnese in southern Greece to the rest of mainland Greece. Syracuse lies on the southeastern tip of Sicily. The settlement had the advantage of fertile land and deep harbours to accommodate ships trading in the Mediterranean Sea. While it retained some links to Corinth, Syracuse became increasingly independent over time and in turn founded its own colonies. By the end of the 5th century BC, the city and its hinterland had a population of around 250,000, rivaling Athens in size and wealth. In 415 BC, during the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta for hegemony over the Greek world, Athens invaded Sicily. As the richest city on the island, Syracuse was the main target and received reinforcements from Sparta and Corinth. With the assistance of a Spartan general, the Syracusans defeated the Athenians, and by 413 BC, the entire Athenian expeditionary force was destroyed, a pivotal episode in the Peloponnesian War. As such, while Syracuse was located considerably to the west of Greece, it was a key player in the wider politics of the Greek world. Moreover, Sicily and southern Italy had developed into part of the intellectual world of the Greeks. Plato most likely travelled here for a time in his middle years, while the mathematician and philosopher Pythagoras founded a school at Croton and Calabria in southern Italy. Therefore, the place Archimedes grew up in and lived during his lifetime was a vibrant one from an intellectual and scientific point of view. Within Syracuse itself, the city had oscillated over time from being a dictatorship ruled by military strongmen and periods of democratic government. At the time of Archimedes' supposed birth in the early 280s BC, the city's long-reigning tyrant, Agathocles, had just died, and the city's politics were once again entering a period of flux. A tyrant, in this ancient context, was a cross between a king and a military dictator. Geopolitical developments in Sicily and the wider Western Mediterranean in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC would also be central to Archimedes' life story. By the time of his birth in the early 3rd century BC, Sicily was caught in the middle of the rivalry between Rome to the north and Carthage to the south. Carthage was a Phoenician colony that had been founded on the northeastern coast of what is now Tunisia by settlers from Tyre in the Levant back in the 9th century BC. It subsequently emerged as one of the great trading and naval powers of the Western Mediterranean, securing control over large parts of North Africa, southern Hispania and the Balearic Islands in the 6th, 5th and 4th centuries BC. It had also set its sights on conquering wealthy Sicily. The Carthaginians had succeeded in doing so to some extent, claiming the western half of the island in the 4th century BC, but Syracuse, particularly during the long reign of Agathocles, had offered strong resistance to the Carthaginians and remained the preeminent power in the west of the island. Meanwhile, further to the north, a newer power was emerging. The Roman Republic was a rustic backwater state of central Italy for much of the 5th and 4th centuries, while Syracuse and Carthage were great powers to the south. But the Romans were becoming an extremely aggressive military people and, in the century prior to Archimedes' birth, had won a series of wars against their neighbours, bringing a wide range of city-states in Latium and Etruria under their control before turning their eyes southwards to the Greek city-states of southern Italy. Syracuse's story in the 3rd century BC would be one of being caught between Rome and Carthage as the two powers fought an epic struggle for dominance of the Western Mediterranean. Archimedes would be caught up in that struggle. In 278 BC, when Archimedes was probably a child of around 9 or 10 years, a Carthaginian army laid siege to Syracuse in the North African state's latest attempt to conquer the entirety of Sicily. In response, the city authorities requested assistance from King Pyrrhus of Epirus. He was the ruler of a Greek kingdom in what is now southeastern Albania and northwestern Greece. Pyrrhus had been fighting the Romans in Italy since 280 BC, after the Greek colonies of the south of the peninsula had called on him to aid them against the increasingly aggressive Romans. Now, 2 years after the Pyrrhic War had started in southern Italy, the Syracusans sent messages to Pyrrhus requesting him to come to their aid as well as against the Carthaginians. Pyrrhus accepted and was subsequently proclaimed as tyrant of Syracuse after helping to defeat the besieging army. By 276 BC, Pyrrhus had conquered most of the island, leaving the Carthaginians confined to the port of Lilybaeum, now known as Marsala, on the western tip of Sicily. However, as the port put up firm resistance, Pyrrhus demanded men and supplies from the Sicilians to build a fleet in order to cut the city off from Carthage by sea. The Sicilians found these demands too onerous and accused Pyrrhus of behaving in a heavy-handed manner. The Syracusans and the Carthaginians eventually made common cause to expel Pyrrhus, fearing he intended to try and secure control of all Sicily for himself, following which a young Syracusan commander named Hiero took control of Syracuse. According to Polybius, Hiero noticed mutinous elements among mercenaries who served in the Syracusan army and addressed the problem by leading a campaign against the Mamertines, a people from southern Italy who settled in Messina in the northeastern corner of Sicily. Hiero deployed the mercenaries at the front of the army and allowed them to be killed by the enemy before withdrawing the rest of his army to safety. While this ploy secured Hiero's position in Syracuse, it encouraged the Mamertines to take the offensive against Syracuse. Hiero mobilized his citizen militia and defeated the Mamertines at a battle near the river Longanus in 269 BC. Then, after his return to Syracuse, he was proclaimed as tyrant or king of the city. The Battle of Longanus would have a greater importance still in years to come, as the Mamertines appealed for assistance from the Romans. They would, in turn, launch their own military campaign to the island, and this led to the outbreak of the First Punic War in 264 BC. The clash was primarily between Rome and Carthage, Punic being a Roman term for the Carthaginians, but Sicily would be central to the First Punic War, which lasted down to 241 BC. Hiero remained tyrant of Syracuse until his death in 215 BC, a few years before Archimedes' own death. Plutarch, writing in the 2nd century AD, claimed that Archimedes was Hiero's kinsman without specifying the degree of their familial relationship. While nothing substantial is known about Archimedes' childhood, a passage in Diodorus indicates that he spent some time studying in Egypt, then ruled by the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty, founded by Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy I, following Alexander's death in 323 BC. By the time Archimedes was in Egypt, the king would have been Ptolemy II, who succeeded his father around 283 BC and reigned until 246 BC. The Ptolemies governed the kingdom from their capital of Alexandria, founded in 331 BC by Alexander. By the early 3rd century BC, Alexandria was developing into a major center of Greek learning, and the famous Library of Alexandria was founded at this time. While in Alexandria, Archimedes is likely to have become acquainted with students of Euclid, the father of geometry, who was active in Alexandria around 300 BC, but was quite likely already dead by the time Archimedes was there. Archimedes corresponded with several Greek mathematicians based in Alexandria, including Konon of Samos, also known for his astronomical discoveries, and Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who is best known for being the first person to calculate the Earth's circumference in around 240 BC. His remarkably accurate estimate of 252,000 stadia, or approximately 40,000 kilometers, is within a margin of error of less than 2.5%. Diodorus claims that while he was in Egypt, Archimedes invented a device for drawing water out of rivers and other bodies of water, now commonly known as the Archimedes screw. The device consists of a spiral thread wrapped around a pole, which when inserted into a tube, allows the user to lift water by turning a handle. According to Diodorus, the Archimedes screw was used in silver mines in Hispania, the ancient name for Spain, to remove water from underground streams to the surface to create a dry environment and facilitate mining operations. A version of the device continues to be used in the Nile Delta to this day for irrigation purposes. While Diodorus credits Archimedes with the invention of the water screw, similar devices had been used in Egypt before his time, and Greek geographer Strabo, writing in the late 1st century BC, refers to a screw being used to draw water from the river Euphrates to irrigate the hanging gardens of Babylon many centuries before Archimedes' time. Although Archimedes was known in the ancient world for inventions such as the water screw, Plutarch noted that he never wrote about the practical application of his ideas and was primarily interested in abstract mathematical concepts. According to Plutarch, Archimedes considered engineering and other practical sciences as, quote, ignoble and vulgar, compared to pure mathematics, which was unconcerned with the necessities of life. Plutarch's account includes anecdotes of Archimedes being so devoted to his mathematical work that he would forget to eat and would have to be forcibly dragged to the bathhouse to clean himself. Even in the bathhouse, he would draw geometrical diagrams with his finger while his body was covered in anointing oil. While Archimedes was acquainted with King Hiero and his son Gello II, there is little evidence for him being involved in or affected by political and military events in Syracuse until near the end of his life. Nevertheless, Archimedes lived against a violent backdrop in the Western Mediterranean. The First Punic War raged for nearly a quarter of a century down to 241 BC, and much of the fighting centered on Sicily, though there were other expeditions launched by both Rome and Carthage to mainland Italy, Sardinia, Corsica, and North Africa. A Roman army laid siege to Syracuse in 263 BC. At that juncture, Hiero chose to make peace with the Romans and agreed to provide military support to them, a decision which made a kind of sense at the time, given that Carthage had been Syracuse's main rival for power on Sicily for 2 centuries. The main Carthaginian base on the island was at Akragas, now the impressive archaeological site of Agrigento in southern Sicily. The Romans began to lay siege to the city in 262 BC. Despite heavy losses, they eventually defeated the Carthaginians in battle, enabling them to capture Akragas and occupy most of the island. However, the Romans struggled to expel the Carthaginians entirely from their remaining outposts on the island amidst staunch Carthaginian resistance and the destruction of several Roman fleets in poor weather. This meant that the Romans did not end the war until 241 BC. They were victorious when they did. Sicily became the first Roman province outside Italy, though Syracuse remained an independent city-state ruled over by Hiero and allied with Rome for the remainder of his reign. Meanwhile, the Carthaginians were forced to cede control over western Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica to Rome. Undeterred, they quickly set about rebuilding their strength by expanding their presence in Hispania in anticipation of a war of revenge against the Romans one day. These events would have considerable implications for Archimedes' later life in Syracuse. Given the lack of reliable historical evidence for Archimedes' life, his surviving scientific treatises provide important insight into his work and personality. It is worth exploring the story of how his treatises survived in some detail. With the exception of his possible stint at Alexandria in Egypt during his younger years, he appears to have spent most of his life in his native Syracuse, where he would have worked on his proofs and theorems before sending them to fellow mathematicians in Alexandria, Athens, and other cities in the eastern Mediterranean. Many scholars of ancient science have noted that Archimedes' work was so sophisticated for the time that only a few dozen people would have been able to understand it. While around 10 different treatises can be definitely attributed to Archimedes, the corpus of his work was first collected in late antiquity, around the 6th century AD, when texts were being transferred from fragile papyrus scrolls onto more durable parchment. Much of this work took place in Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire, which continued to flourish after the decline of Rome in the West. During the 6th century, Eutocius of Ascalon provided detailed commentaries on Archimedes, and it appears that these commentaries were included in a compilation of Archimedes' work by his friend Isidore of Miletus, best known as the architect of the Cathedral of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Although Isidore's edition is lost, it seems to have inspired at least 3 codices containing Archimedes' work, which were made in Constantinople during the 9th and 10th centuries. The most comprehensive of these was made in the 9th century and includes a dedication to Leo the Geometer, an influential mathematician and philosopher whose cousin, John the Grammarian, served as Patriarch of Constantinople. The 19th century Danish historian and philologist Johann Ludwig Heiberg called this Codex A. Heiberg theorized that another codex, Codex B, contained several of Archimedes' treatises, including the 2 parts of a text entitled On Floating Bodies, which were not included in Codex A. These 2 Byzantine codices were removed from Constantinople in 1204 when the city was sacked by Latin crusaders during the 4th Crusade. By 1269, they were in the collection of the Papal Library at Viterbo in central Italy, where yet another scholar, William of Moerbeke, translated them from Greek into a Latin edition of Archimedes. Codex B may have been lost in the early 14th century, as subsequent Latin translations do not contain a treatise called On Floating Bodies, and are therefore taken from Codex A, which remained one of the most valuable ancient texts in Renaissance Italy until it was lost in the middle of the 16th century. A third codex, dating from around 975 AD, which Heiberg called Codex C, was discovered during the 19th century and was examined by Heiberg in 1906. Better known as the Archimedes palimpsest, after the sack of Constantinople in 1204, the book was taken to the Crusader states in the Levant for safekeeping. It is known to have been in the collection of the library of the monastery of St. Sabas near Bethlehem. Before its acquisition by St. Sabas, the majority of Codex C was transformed into a prayer book in the early 13th century, most likely in nearby Jerusalem. Since parchment was expensive, it was common practice to unbind older books, scrape and remove the ink from its pages, and then use the freshly erased parchment to write a new text, making a palimpsest. This was the fate of the Archimedes Codex, whose diagrams and theorems were meaningless to the Orthodox Christian community in the Holy Land. They took the Archimedes Codex, removed the binding, and tried to scrape off the ink on each page. They then cut through the fold of each two-page spread, turned each leaf 90 degrees, and folded them together so that each page of the prayer book was half the size of the original codex. Only 2/3 of the codex survives in the palimpsest, which also contains material from several other codices. Modern imaging technology indicates that the prayer book was written by a priest named John Myronas and was completed on the 14th of April 1229. By 1846, the Archimedes palimpsest was found in the collection of the Metochion of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. After the Greek scholar Papadopoulos Karameus catalogued the book in 1899 and transcribed some of the mathematical passages that could still be read, Heiberg recognized it was a text that had been written by Archimedes and examined the book in the summer of 1906. With only his naked eye and a magnifying glass, Heiberg made out a remarkable amount of the original text and discovered a previously lost treatise by Archimedes called The Method, as well as parts of On Floating Bodies that were not included in Moebiker's earlier Latin edition. The codex also included a puzzle called the Stomachion, which had been attributed to Archimedes from Arabic sources, but was not considered authentic. Although he was unable to read all of the text, Heiberg was able to incorporate the method into a new Greek edition of Archimedes' work. The Cambridge scholar Thomas Heath, who had translated all of Archimedes' known work into English in 1897, translated The Method in 1912 from Heiberg's text. In the 1920s, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed and hostilities broke out between Turkey and Greece, the palimpsest was removed from the Metochion and spent much of the 20th century languishing in a Parisian basement until 1998, when it was sold to an anonymous American buyer who deposited it at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. Although the book was in much worse condition than when Heiberg saw it, conservation work and the application of new technology has allowed modern scholars to read parts of the text that Heiberg could not decipher a century earlier. Thus, the copies of Archimedes' treatises have had a very colourful history in order to survive down to the present day. And yet, despite all of this work retrieving his texts, it is not possible from the available evidence to develop a clear chronology of when Archimedes wrote each of these texts. Despite these limitations, the treatises written by Archimedes which have survived and anecdotes from the work of others shed light on his work and life in many different ways. By far the most famous anecdote about Archimedes involves him jumping out of a bath and running into the street naked, shouting "Eureka!" after making a discovery. The earliest version of the tale is found in De Architectura, a 10-volume book on architecture by Vitruvius, a Roman architect and engineer who lived during the 1st century BC. In Vitruvius's account, King Hiero wanted to make an offering to the gods at a temple and commissioned an artisan to make what is usually understood as a gold votive crown, but is more likely to have resembled a wreath. The king measured out a quantity of gold and gave it to the craftsman, who duly presented an item of exquisite beauty to the king. However, after hearing rumours that the artisan had defrauded the king by substituting part of the gold for an equal mass of silver, Hiero decided to investigate and asked Archimedes to find a way to test the object's purity without breaking it. Archimedes struggled to find a solution until he made what may have been a rare trip to the bathhouse. As he lowered himself into the bathtub, Archimedes noticed that the further he sank into it, the more water spilled out of the tub. Realizing he had the solution to the king's problem, Archimedes forgot to put his clothes back on and ran home naked, shouting Eureka or Evreka, a Greek word meaning "I have found it." After returning home, Archimedes made 2 lumps of gold and silver of identical mass to the king's wreath, submerged them into water, and measured the amount of water displaced by each. As gold is much denser than silver, a lump of gold is much smaller in volume compared to a lump of silver of the same mass, and displaced a smaller amount of water. Next, he placed the king's wreath into the water and found that it displaced more water than the lump of pure gold. Archimedes was therefore able to tell that the volume of the wreath was greater than that of the pure gold, and accordingly the metals within were less dense, proving that the wreath was indeed made from a mixture of gold and silver, not pure gold. Vitruvius does not offer any information on the fate of the fraudulent craftsman who sought to deceive both the king and the gods, but it is unlikely to have been a pleasant one. While setting the scene for this tale, Vitruvius states that Hiero had commissioned the crown to celebrate the military successes which made him king. This means that the crown would have been made in the first half of the 260s BC, shortly after Hiero's victory at Longanus. If the anecdote is genuine, the Archimedes who ran out of the bath naked, shouting Eureka, was not a bearded old man, as is often suggested in accounts of this episode, but rather a youth in his late teens or early 20s. Many historians and scholars of ancient science and mathematics cast doubt on the accuracy of the anecdote by arguing that the displacement of water from a bathtub would have been far too trivial an observation for a sophisticated mathematician such as Archimedes to shout Eureka about. Instead, it is noted that Vitruvius was aware that Archimedes had written a treatise on floating bodies, but that he had misunderstood Archimedes' discovery, which was about buoyancy rather than the density of substances like gold and silver, and invented the story about the bathtub as a result. One of the most famous quotes attributed to Archimedes is commonly rendered as, "Give me a place to stand and I can move the earth." This quote is found in Plutarch's work. He states that Archimedes told King Hiero that, quote, "if there were another world and he could go to it, he could move this." When the king asked Archimedes what he meant, he undertook to construct a system of compound pulleys which enabled him to move a fully laden three-masted ship across the water with considerable ease. An alternative account, involving Archimedes launching a ship, is found in the De Hypnosophisti, a text written by a Greek writer, Athenaeus of Naucratis, in the early 3rd century AD. The De Hypnosophisti takes the form of a fictionalized set of dialogues between a large group of intellectuals at a series of dinner parties hosted by Athenaeus. Athenaeus cites a treatise by a certain Moschian about a great ship commissioned by Hiero called the Syracusia, the construction of which was supervised by Archimedes. The shipwrights had difficulty launching the ship to sea until Archimedes came up with the solution. Rather than using a system of pulleys, Athenaeus claims that Archimedes invented a winch to pull the vessel to sea. Archimedes' boast about being able to move the world is based on his work on levers, found in his 2 treatises on the equilibrium of planes, which was probably among the earliest of his surviving works. Archimedes followed Euclid's example in setting out postulates or assumptions, followed by a series of propositions which are then proven based on the initial assumptions. He began in this instance by envisaging 2 weights resting on a horizontal stick supported by a fulcrum. The postulates then include basic observations such as the idea that 2 objects of equal weight that are an equal distance apart from the fulcrum will balance, and that if one of the weights is increased, that side would go down, while correspondingly, if it is decreased, the opposite side goes down. From these postulates, Archimedes methodically proved a series of propositions which allows him to derive the law of the lever, namely, that 2 different weights are balanced on a fulcrum when their lever arms are reciprocally proportional to their size. In other words, if the size of one of the 2 weights being balanced is doubled, then its distance to the fulcrum must be half that of the distance between the weight on the opposite side and the fulcrum in order to maintain the balance. Based on this principle, a small amount of force can lift a large weight using a lever and a fulcrum if the lever arm is sufficiently long. This forms the basis for Archimedes' belief that he could move the world if he had a lever and a place to stand. It also demonstrates how he could have aided Hiero in launching his enormous ship out into the harbour of Syracuse. Archimedes' fulcrum represented the center of gravity of two objects on a balance, basically the center of a seesaw. In the rest of On the Equilibrium of Planes, he applied a similar technique to determine the center of gravity for two-dimensional shapes, such as parallelograms and triangles. The center of gravity for a parallelogram is relatively straightforward, since it is the point at which two diagonal lines joining the corners intersect in the center of the shape. It is a more challenging task to find the center of gravity for a triangle, which has no obvious center. Archimedes relies heavily on proof of contradiction, namely, by first making an assertion that can be proven false based on existing assumptions and logical deductions, and therefore proving that the opposite is true. Through this process, Archimedes worked out that a triangle's center of gravity lies at the intersection point of lines drawn from any two angles to the center point of the opposite side. Parallelograms and triangles are formed of straight lines, but Archimedes was particularly interested in curved lines and shapes. Another of his earlier works is Quadrature of the Parabola. It is one of several surviving treatises addressed to a man named Dositheus in Alexandria. Little is known about him other than what is revealed by Archimedes' correspondence with him. Archimedes begins his letter to Dositheus by lamenting the death of Conon of Samos, whom he describes as, quote, not only a friend, but an admirable mathematician. Conon was known to have been active around 245 BC, when he discovered a constellation and named it Coma Berenices, or Berenice's hair, after the wife of King Ptolemy III of Egypt. Although none of Archimedes' correspondence with Conon survives, he had written to him about mathematics and intended to do so again. Upon learning of Conon's death, Archimedes decided to send it to Dositheus, who had known Conon in Alexandria. In his letter, Archimedes referred to previous attempts by other mathematicians to square the circle, in other words, to determine how to take a circle and create a square or rectangular shape out of the same area, which would enable them to measure the area of the circle. Greek mathematicians had figured out how to measure the area of any shape bound by straight lines, no matter how complex, by dividing them into triangles, calculating their area, and then adding them all up to find the total. In their efforts to square the circle, the Greek mathematicians before Archimedes tried to divide up the circle into smaller segments, but while some of his predecessors offered proofs, Archimedes was not convinced by them. In Quadrature of the Parabola, Archimedes sought to measure the area of a related shape, a parabola, which is made from cutting a cone parallel to one side. Through a process of logical reasoning and proof by contradiction, Archimedes proved that the area of a parabola is 4/3 that of a triangle bounded by it. Archimedes tells Dositheus that he had initially come to the proof, quote, by means of mechanics, before arriving at a geometric proof. Another of his treatises, The Method of Mechanical Theorems, is the only one of his surviving works to demonstrate this mechanical method. The introductory letter is addressed to Eratosthenes of Cyrene, whom Archimedes praises as, quote, a man of considerable eminence in philosophy and an admirer of mathematical inquiry. Archimedes begins the letter by referring to a previous letter he sent to Eratosthenes, in which he challenged him to come up with proofs of some of his new theorems. Archimedes not only presented his proofs, but also what he described as his mechanical method, which he believed could be used to solve a set of similar problems. Archimedes begins by giving an alternative proof of his discovery in Quadrature of the Parabola by considering shapes as physical objects on a balance supported by a fulcrum, with their sizes representing different weights. After this, Archimedes moved on to proofs involving more complex shapes. From these findings, mathematicians have concluded that Archimedes was close to making the discoveries about gravity and mechanics that Galileo and Newton would make 2,000 years later. In the second part of On the Equilibrium of Planes, which is believed to have been written after Quadrature of the Parabola, Archimedes investigates the center of gravity for a parabola and determines that it lies on its axis 2/5 of the way up from the base to its vertex. Archimedes' work with curved shapes brought him into contact with the concept of infinity, which most ancient Greek mathematicians were keen to avoid engaging with. How did a person measure infinity? It seemed like such a tricky issue that few wanted to contemplate it. Archimedes developed his own approach to doing so. A circle, or any curved shape, has an infinite number of sides, which is why it is impossible to precisely transform a circle into a shape with straight sides. However, in his treatise entitled Measurement of a Circle, which only survives in fragmentary form in the various codices, Archimedes approximated the area of a circle by constructing polygons with an increasing number of sizes to fill a circle. He eventually arrives at a 96-sided polygon and calculates that the ratio of the circumference of a circle to its diameter is between 223 to 71 and 22 to 7. In decimal form, Archimedes' estimate of this ratio, represented by the Greek letter pi, was between 3.14084 and 3.14286. If he had increased the number of sides of his theoretical polygon towards infinity, he would have arrived at a more precise approximation of pi, now known to be 3.14159. This approach is known as the method of exhaustion and was used by Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and Isaac Newton in the 17th century to develop modern calculus, the branch of mathematics that studies continuous change. It also points towards the intellectual milieu Archimedes was living within in southern Italy and Sicily. It was Pythagoras who, as we have seen, developed his own school in southern Italy, who had developed a theorem nearly 3 centuries earlier, which allowed for the development of pi in the first place. Knowing pi enabled Archimedes to calculate the area of the circle, which is calculated by multiplying pi and the square of the radius. But Archimedes believed that his greatest achievement was his treatise On the Sphere and the Cylinder, which again was addressed to Dositheus, who seemingly became one of his principal correspondents after the death of Conon of Samos. In his treatise, Archimedes states that he has proven that the surface area of a sphere is 4 times that of its greatest circle, and that the volume of a sphere is 2/3 that of a cylinder which encompasses it. Archimedes could use this to calculate the volume of a sphere, which is equal to 4 times pi multiplied by the radius of its greatest circle cubed. In the introductory letter, Archimedes once again expressed his regret that Conon was no longer alive, as, quote, "he would best have been able to grasp them and pronounce upon them the appropriate verdict." Nevertheless, he hoped that Dositheus would be able to help him disseminate his results among the mathematical community in Alexandria. Dositheus subsequently asked Archimedes for the answers to a set of mathematical problems that he had previously sent to Conon. Archimedes responded by informing his correspondent that many of the problems could be solved using the findings in the previous treatise, but set out the solutions as requested in what is now categorized as Part 2 of On the Sphere and the Cylinder. At the end of the introductory letter, Archimedes promised to send Dositheus solutions to problems involving spirals and conoids, which involved a different approach. In a lengthy letter to Dositheus, prefacing his treatise on spirals, Archimedes apologizes for taking so long to send the proofs that had been requested, citing his, quote, "desire to communicate them first to persons engaged in mathematical studies and anxious to investigate them." This suggests that Dositheus was not a mathematician himself, or at least had stopped studying mathematics to such an extent that Archimedes believed he would not be abreast of the latest research. Archimedes also reveals that 2 of the 9 propositions that he set out in the second part of On the Sphere and the Cylinder were intentionally wrong, and goes on to prove why. By the time Archimedes delivered On Spirals to Dositheus, many years had elapsed since Conon's death. Had Conon lived, Archimedes believed that, quote, "he would have discovered and made manifest all these things, and would have enriched geometry by many other discoveries besides." All of this suggests that Conon of Samos was a much more substantial mathematician than the surviving evidence allows us to reconstruct, and that Archimedes' own discoveries were forged out of their close intellectual partnership. In Conon's absence, nobody else had solved Archimedes' problems, and he decided it was time to publish the proofs and see who might respond to his work. Archimedes may not have had high regard for Dositheus as a mathematician, but since half of his surviving work is addressed to him, Dositheus performed admirably in ensuring that Archimedes' treatises were known in Alexandria and ensured their survival for posterity. Thus, Dositheus should primarily be viewed as someone who helped disseminate and popularize Archimedes' work in Alexandria and the heartland of Hellenistic civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean. Archimedes' work on spherical and conic objects, as well as his work on centers of gravity, enabled him to investigate how such objects would behave when submerged in water in his treatise on floating bodies. In this, he worked from the theory that each column of equal volume in a body of liquid is also of equal weight. Otherwise, the liquid would flow from the heavier to the lighter side. Archimedes then determined that a column of liquid with a solid object immersed in it remains the same weight as the column without such an object. For this to be true, the solid object would have to lose some of its weight. If it is lighter than the liquid, it would float and part of it would remain above the surface. But even if it is heavier than the liquid and sinks to the bottom, it would still experience some weight loss. Archimedes deduced that the weight lost is equal to the volume of water that has been displaced. This discovery, now known as the Archimedes principle, may have inspired the famous story about Archimedes running naked from the bathhouse shouting "Eureka!" However, the discovery of the Archimedes principle is much more complicated than coming to the realization that larger objects displace a greater volume of water. In the second part of On Floating Bodies, Archimedes proved how different types of shapes floated in liquids of different densities, a discipline now known as hydrostatics. While Archimedes was primarily interested in the mathematical and geometric attributes of the shapes in question, his investigation of curved shapes and their centers of gravity in water had their applications in shipbuilding. The Carthaginians and Romans were already building sophisticated ships at this time, but it is possible that his ideas on hydrostatics were incorporated into shipbuilding methods in the Western Mediterranean later in his life. While most of Archimedes' work was intended for fellow mathematicians, the sand reckoner is addressed to Gello II of Syracuse, the son of Hiero II. Gello died in 216 BC, shortly before his father, which suggests that he and his father ruled Syracuse as joint tyrants from around 240 BC. Archimedes expects Gello to understand the mathematics contained in the treatise, which has led some scholars to propose that the young Gello was a student of Archimedes. In the Sand Reckoner, Archimedes sets himself the challenge of calculating how many grains of sand would fill the universe. Archimedes was familiar with astronomy and astronomical discoveries, since his father Phidias and his late friend and correspondent Conon were both astronomers. However, while the universe serves as Archimedes' drawing board, the Sand Reckoner is primarily concerned with very large numbers and the concept of infinity. He tells King Gello that some people assume that the number of grains of sand on Earth is infinite, since there is no way of expressing such a number. Archimedes aims to demonstrate that not only is the number of grains of sand on Earth not infinite, but the number of grains of sand in the universe is not infinite. To do so, he had to expand on the Greek numbering system. The largest number the Greeks had a word for was a myriad, or 10,000. Archimedes first suggested that there can be a number as large as 1,000,000, or a myriad myriads. This was only the first step. Archimedes then proposed calling the numbers 1 to 1,000,000 the first order, with a million as the first unit of a second order of numbers, and so on until the millionth order. Using various assumptions about the size of the Earth, the Sun, the stars and their relationship to the entire universe, as well as his expanded number system, Archimedes calculated that the number of grains of sand to fill the universe was 10 to the power of 63. Many of Archimedes' assumptions in coming to this figure are erroneous, such as his assumption that the circumference of the Earth is 3 million stadia. His friend Eratosthenes' figure of 252,000 stadia is much more accurate. Archimedes also assumed that the Sun is no more than 30 times the diameter of the Moon. This was closer to the 12 times that his father Phidias had proposed, but still far from the actual ratio of 400 times. Archimedes also referred to the astronomer Aristarchus, who proposed a heliocentric model of the universe in which the Earth orbits the Sun rather than the other way round. Although Archimedes, like virtually all other ancient scientists, was not convinced of this, he accepted Aristarchus' argument that the universe was much bigger than commonly believed. Using his assumptions, Archimedes calculated that the size of the universe was a sphere 2 light-years in diameter, whereas modern astronomy has shown that the observable universe is 93 billion light-years in diameter and still expanding. The accuracy of Archimedes' answer is not so important as the process by which he arrived at it. Indeed, Archimedes was seeking to calculate an upper bound for the size of the universe in order to show that it is possible to represent a large number, such as the number of grains of sand in the universe. Nevertheless, Archimedes' interest in the heavens was not purely theoretical. According to the Roman writer and statesman Cicero, Archimedes constructed 2 astronomical models, which were taken to Rome following his death. The first of these was a hemisphere which represented the night sky, while the second was a model of the universe based on the description of the astronomer Euxodus of Cernidus, who lived a century earlier and whose work he references in The Sand Reckoner. Archimedes may have described the process of building these models in On Sphere Making, a lost treatise referenced by the mathematician Pappus of Alexandria, who lived in the 4th century AD. The Sand Reckoner is generally regarded as the most approachable of Archimedes' treatises and reveals a playful side to his character. He is also known for coming up with mathematical puzzles for his fellow mathematicians. Such is the case with the Stomachion, a treatise which appears in the Archimedes palimpsest. Here, Archimedes divides a square into 14 straight-edged puzzle pieces and asks how many ways the pieces can be arranged to form a square. It has been calculated that there are 17,152 different solutions to the puzzle. The branch of mathematics involved in finding different solutions to the same problem is known as combinatorics, and is used in computer science to determine the most efficient way of solving a particular problem. Archimedes is also associated with a remarkably complex problem known as the cattle problem. It takes the form of a Greek poem of 44 lines addressed to Eratosthenes of Cyrene, in which he is asked to work out the number of cattle in the herd of the sun god Helios based on a series of increasingly convoluted numerical relationships between cattle of various colours and patterns. While some scholars have argued that Archimedes could not have written the poem, since it was not his style of writing, others hold that by setting out his problem in verse, Archimedes was effectively making a joke at his friend's expense. The answer was first calculated in the 19th century and runs to over 200,000 digits. The available evidence suggests that Archimedes undertook much of his most important work in the 230s BC and 220s BC, roughly between his late 40s and late 60s. This was a period of comparative peace in the Western Mediterranean, especially so on Sicily, where relative tranquility prevailed after the end of the First Punic War in 241 BC. Rome was now the dominant power on the island, and Hiero ruled Syracuse as a Roman client. Trouble was brewing, though. In the decades following the First Punic War, the Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca and later his sons Hasdrubal and Hannibal gained control over much of the Iberian Peninsula. In 219 BC, Hannibal besieged and captured the town of Saguntum on the east coast of Spain. Saguntum was a Roman ally, prompting Rome to declare war on Carthage in response. While minor naval actions took place off the coast of Sicily in 218 BC, Hannibal's main objective was an invasion of Rome. He gathered an army at New Carthage, present-day Cartagena, on the southeastern coast of Spain. Rather than risk losing his army at sea, Hannibal led his men into southern Gaul, the ancient name for France, and embarked on his legendary crossing of the Alps. The Carthaginians surprised the Romans by crossing into northern Italy by November, and over the next 2 years, Hannibal demonstrated that he was one of the greatest military leaders of the ancient world by inflicting major defeats on the Romans, most notably at the Battle of Cannae on the 2nd of August 216 BC, where he surrounded and destroyed a Roman army of 86,000 men in one of the most celebrated battles in military history. Hannibal's great victory at Cannae prompted many of Rome's former allies to switch sides, joining with Carthage, with many believing Hannibal would soon descend on Rome itself and defeat the Republic there. Although Hiero of Syracuse had been a loyal Roman ally in Sicily, his death in 215 BC led to the accession of his 15-year-old grandson, Hieronymus. Hieronymus broke his ties to Rome and agreed an alliance with Hannibal in exchange for recognition as ruler of all eastern Sicily once the war was over. Although the Syracusans subsequently tried to reverse this approach, when Hieronymus was assassinated in 214 BC, by then the distinguished Roman general, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, had already taken command of a large Roman expeditionary force which was preparing to lay siege to Syracuse by land and sea. It would provide the thrilling last chapter to Archimedes' life, one in which his scientific accomplishments would mix with the tortuous history of his time. From Polybius, we learn that the Romans prepared extensively for the attack on Syracuse and anticipated that they would take the city within 5 days, but they failed to take into account Archimedes' abilities. Archimedes was responsible for the design of a series of complex siege machines that defended the city against the Roman attack. Plutarch states that some time before his death, Archimedes was asked to build all sorts of offensive and defensive siege machines by King Hiero. These lay dormant while Syracuse remained at peace, but proved valuable when the city was attacked by Marcellus. Syracuse was already well protected by a defensive wall sitting on top of a chain of hills around the city, enabling Archimedes to position his machines to cover approaches from both land and sea. The Roman general Appius Claudius began an attack from the land, while Marcellus took a fleet of 60 quinqueremes manned with soldiers who launched missiles and javelins against the Syracusan garrison posted on the walls. The Romans built a device called the sambuca, which was designed to be positioned against the city walls to enable the soldiers to approach the battlements directly from their ships. While the ships were still approaching the city, Archimedes began by bombarding the Roman fleet with his long-range catapults. When the Romans got closer, Archimedes' shorter-range catapults continued the bombardment. These machines put his extensive work on levers over the years to good use. While none of his surviving treatises indicates that Archimedes worked on mathematical problems involving ballistics, he would have had to do so in order to build catapults of specific ranges to ensure that the city was covered from every angle and at every distance. With his men suffering great casualties, Marcellus withdrew and instead attempted to approach at night and assault the walls at close range. As Marcellus had anticipated, the catapults could no longer be used, but archers behind loopholes shot arrows at the Romans. When Marcellus attempted to deploy the sambucae against the walls, Archimedes deployed swinging arms which had been concealed behind the walls to drop rocks on the contraptions, causing them to break, while also inflicting casualties on those aboard the Roman ships. Polybius also described a metal hook Archimedes designed to lift the Roman ships by the prow before sending them crashing down, causing havoc among the crews and occasionally causing the ships to capsize. A famous tale about Archimedes' work as a siege engineer involves him setting fire to the ships of the Romans using curved mirrors that concentrated the sun's rays on the wooden ships. The Roman writer Lucian, who lived in the 2nd century AD, was the first to claim that Archimedes set fire to enemy ships in this way, but did not elaborate further. A more detailed description of Archimedes using mirrors to burn Roman ships is found in the treatise On Burning Mirrors by Anthemius of Tralles, a 5th century AD Byzantine mathematician. Historians and mathematicians over the centuries have debated whether Archimedes could have used giant mirrors to burn Roman ships. While it is possible to use a set of mirrors to concentrate enough heat on a single point and set it on fire, modern scientists doubt that it would have been possible to do so to a ship out on the water outside Syracuse. Even without burning mirrors, the defences Archimedes helped establish at Syracuse were formidable enough, and Marcellus decided to abandon the assault by sea. Syracuse continued to hold out against the Roman siege until 212 BC. According to the Roman historian Livy, at that juncture a small group of Romans noticed that one section of the city wall was lower than the others. Meanwhile, a deserter informed the Romans that the city was celebrating a festival in honor of Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, and Marcellus believed that the Syracusans would be off their guard. He sent a party of men with ladders to scale the wall, and the rest of the army soon followed behind. As he had anticipated, the Syracusan garrison was drunk and failed to respond effectively. The Romans on the wall opened the gates from inside and enabled the army and its commander to enter the city. Plutarch states that when Syracuse was captured by the Romans, Archimedes was working on a geometric problem with a diagram and was unaware of what had happened until a Roman soldier entered his house. Plutarch gives 3 different versions of what occurred next. In one telling, the soldier attempted to arrest Archimedes and bring him to Marcellus as a prisoner of war, but the mathematician insisted on finishing his proof before leaving. This act of resistance made the soldier angry, and he drew his sword and killed him. In an alternative account, the soldier had already drawn his sword when the latter pleaded for time to finish his work, but the soldier took no notice and killed him immediately. Plutarch offers a third account, which claims that Archimedes was bringing some mathematical instruments to Marcellus when a group of Roman soldiers believed he had treasure with him and killed him. Marcellus was shocked to learn of Archimedes' death and had expressly ordered his soldiers not to harm any free citizen of the city. He punished the soldier responsible. After his death, Archimedes, who had seemingly lived to his mid-70s, was buried in a tomb featuring a diagram of a sphere and a cylinder to represent what he considered his greatest achievement, the calculation of the volume and surface area of a sphere. Over time, the tomb became overgrown and was considered lost until 75 BC, when the great rhetorician and orator Cicero was serving as a Roman official in Sicily. He was a great admirer of Greek culture and knew of a description of Archimedes' tomb which referred to the diagram and a poem inscribed on it. He was determined to discover where the tomb of the great scientist was and began looking at the tombs near the western gate. After identifying a small column with a sphere and cylinder on it, he ordered men to clear away the shrubs which had grown around it, allowing him to read part of the poem he knew to be on Archimedes' tomb. Cicero included this anecdote in his philosophical work, Tusculan Disputations, in which he laments that the Syracusans have neglected the tomb of their greatest scientist. Archimedes of Syracuse is universally regarded as one of the greatest mathematicians and scientists in history. Much of his fame in the ancient world was based on his reputation as an inventor and an engineer. His role as a siege engineer during the siege of Syracuse at the very end of his life is one of the few facts that can be reliably established about his life from the historical record. Nevertheless, based on Plutarch's description of his character and evidence from his surviving works, it appears that Archimedes was primarily interested in pure mathematics rather than their application in the physical world. Working in Syracuse during the 3rd century BC, some of Archimedes' mathematics was so sophisticated that it was only surpassed by the likes of Galileo and Newton some 2,000 years later. He is primarily remembered today as an individual who worked on the nature of gravity and floating bodies, but his interests were much wider, encompassing discussion of the measurement of infinity and a wide range of other mathematical concepts. Indeed, so complex were some of the equations that he tried to develop that it has only been possible to resolve them fully using modern computers. His work on algebra and trigonometry also informed modern mathematics. Hence, while he is often caricatured as an individual who ran naked from a bathtub shouting "Eureka," or who built a complex mirror tower to fend off the Romans, Archimedes' intellectual heft was far greater than is sometimes allowed for. What do you think of Archimedes? Was he the most influential mathematician of the ancient world, or was his work overly theoretical to have had much of an impact on applied mathematics? Please, let us know in the comment section. And, in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.